The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sapphire Lounge, blurring the city lights into a smear of neon gold and gray. Elena gripped her glass, the amber liquid swirling dangerously close to the rim. It was her third specialty cocktail, or was it her fourth? The office gala was a sea of stiff tuxedos and forced laughter, but all she could focus on was the heat crawling up her neck. "Another one, sweetheart?" the bartender asked, his voice sounding like it was underwater. "Just one more," Elena murmured, her words tangling together. She shouldn't have been here. She was just a junior assistant, the girl who organized files and made sure the printer didn't jam. But tonight the music was too loud, the air was too thin, and the man standing by the balcony looked far too lonely. He was a silhouette of sharp angles and expensive wool. He didn't move, didn't drink, didn't even seem to breathe. He just stared out at the storm like he owned the clouds themselves. Elena felt a surge of liquid courage. She stumbled toward him, her heels clicking unevenly on the marble. "You look like you're planning a murder," she chirped, leaning heavily against the railing next to him. The man didn't turn. His profile was carved from ice. A straight nose, a jawline that could cut glass, and eyes so dark they swallowed the light. "I'm thinking," he said, his voice a low melodic growl. "Thinking is boring," Elena laughed, swaying closer until she could smell his cologne, sandalwood and cold rain. "You rich guys are all the same. Stiff. Boring. You probably have a spreadsheet for your feelings." Finally he turned. The sheer intensity of his gaze made her breath hitch. Up close he wasn't just handsome, he was a force of nature. "Is that so?" he asked, his eyes tracking the way she struggled to stay upright. "Mum," she hummed, reaching out with a daring, clumsy finger to poke his chest. It was like hitting a brick wall. "You need to live a little. Break a rule. Have a drink that isn't whatever expensive water you're sipping." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, hard and predatory. "Careful, Elena. You might regret being so bold when the sun comes up." Her brow furrowed. "How do you know my name?" "I know everything that happens in my building," he whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear. Before she could process the weight of those words, the world tilted. The lights of the gala spun into a kaleidoscope of colors, and the last thing she felt was a pair of strong, steady arms catching her before she hit the floor. The sunlight wasn't a gentle wake-up call. It was a physical assault. Elena groaned, burying her face into a pillow that smelled faintly of expensive sandalwood and something sharp, like a winter forest. It was the softest thing she had ever felt, certainly higher quality than the scratchy department store linens in her cramped apartment. "Wait, sandalwood?" Her eyes snapped open. The ceiling was impossibly high, coffered with dark wood and minimalist recessed lighting. This wasn't her studio apartment with the leaky faucet. This was a penthouse that looked like it belonged in an architectural digest. She bolted upright and the world immediately began to spin. Her head throbbed with a rhythmic pulsing beat that matched the frantic thudding of her heart. Slowly the memories of the night before began to flicker back like a broken film reel. The velvet dress, the fourth cocktail, the cold, handsome stranger on the balcony, and, oh no, she had poked him. She had told a billionaire he was boring. Elena looked down. She was still in her slip, but her dress was neatly folded on a chair across the room. Panicked, she scanned the space for her shoes when the heavy oak door drifted open. Julian Vance stepped in. He wasn't wearing the tuxedo from last night. Instead he wore a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that looked like they were sculpted from marble. He held a glass of water and 2 tablets in one hand. "You're awake," he said. His voice was just as cold and deep as she remembered, but there was a terrifying edge of calm to it now. I am so sorry," Elena stammered, clutching the silk duvet to her chest. "I don't know what came over me. The drinks, the music, I'll leave right now. I'll be out of your hair in 2 minutes." Julian didn't move. He stood at the foot of the bed, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You told me I had a spreadsheet for my feelings, Elena. You also told me my tie was too aggressive for someone who clearly doesn't know how to have fun." Elena felt like she might actually melt into the floor. "Please tell me I didn't say that." "You did. Along with several other things that would normally get a person blacklisted from every firm in the city." He stepped closer, setting the water and medicine on the nightstand. "Drink. You look like you're about to faint." She took the glass, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arm that had nothing to do with the hangover. She swallowed the pills in silence, her mind racing. How did I get here? You passed out in my arms before you could tell me where you lived, Julian said, his eyes never leaving hers. And since I didn't feel like leaving my own gala to drop a stranger at a hospital, I brought you here. My housekeeper saw to your comfort. Thank you, she whispered, looking at her lap. I'll go now. I have work in an hour and my boss is a nightmare about punctuality. A slow, dangerous smirk spread across Julian's face. It wasn't a kind look. It was the look of a cat who had finally caught the mouse. Is that so? Well, since I'm the one who signed the merger papers for your agency at 6 a.m. this morning, I suppose I should introduce myself properly. He leaned down, placing his hands on the mattress on either side of her, pinning her in place with his gaze. I'm Julian Vance. I'm your new suit. And you're already 10 minutes late for your first briefing in my office. Elena's heart stopped. The man she had insulted, poked, and drunkenly lectured was now the man who owned her career. Get dressed, Elena, he whispered, his breath warm against her cheek. The car is waiting downstairs. Don't make me wait. I don't like being bored. The ride to the office was a blur of tinted glass and suffocating silence. Elena sat as far away from Julian as the leather interior of the Maybach allowed, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. Julian didn't look at her once. He was focused on a tablet, his thumb swiping through data with a clinical, detached precision. When they arrived at the Vance Global headquarters, the lobby felt like a cathedral of glass and steel. Every head turned as Julian walked in, his presence commanding a sudden, heavy quiet. Elena followed 2 steps behind, feeling the burn of 100 curious stares. She was still wearing her gala dress from the night before, covered only by a trench coat Julian's housekeeper had lent her. Mr. Vance, your 9 a.m. is in the boardroom, a polished secretary said, scurrying to keep up with his stride. Cancel it, Julian said without slowing down. Send Ms. Elena's belongings to my executive assistant station. She'll be working out of the glass office connected to mine from now on. Elena tripped over her own feet. The glass office? Mr. Vance, I'm a junior assistant. I'm supposed to be on the 4th floor with the filing team. Julian stopped abruptly, causing Elena to nearly walk into his broad back. He turned, his shadow looming over her. The 4th floor is for people who follow rules. You, Elena, seem to have a talent for breaking them. I prefer to keep my liabilities where I can see them. He pushed open the double doors to his private suite. The glass office was exactly that, a fishbowl that sat directly against his own massive desk. There was no privacy, no escape. Your first task, Julian said, dropping a thick stack of folders onto her new desk. These are the last 3 years of merger archives. I want a summary of every discrepancy by lunch. But I haven't even had coffee, she whispered, her head still throbbing. Julian leaned over her desk, his face inches from hers. The coldness was back, but there was a spark of something else in his eyes. A challenge. Then I suggest you move quickly. There's a kitchen down the hall. And Elena. She looked up, trapped by his gaze. Don't think that because I carried you to bed last night I'll carry you through this job. You wanted me to live a little? This is how I live. I work. And now so do you. As he walked into his office and the glass door slid shut with a soft hiss, Elena realized this wasn't just a job. It was a cage. And as she watched him pick up his phone, looking every bit the cold, untouchable king of the city, she saw him glance her way for a split second. A look that said he remembered exactly how she had felt in his arms, even if he would never admit it. The morning dragged on in a haze of numbers and fine print. Just as Elena was starting to find a rhythm, a sharp click-clack of high heels echoed against the marble floor outside. The door swung open and a woman who looked like she'd stepped off a Parisian runway marched in. Julian, darling, the woman trilled, ignoring Elena entirely and heading straight for Julian's private door. I heard you had a little mishap at the gala. I came to see if you needed a real professional to clean up the mess. She stopped at the glass wall, finally noticing Elena. Her eyes dragged up and down Elena's borrowed coat with visible at the corner of her mouth. And who is this? The new intern? Or did you find her on the street? The woman's voice was like ice water down Elena's spine. She stood there, draped in a silk trench coat that clearly cost more than Elena's annual salary, her eyes narrowed with a sharp, predatory curiosity. "I asked a question, Julian," the woman prompted, her gaze still fixed on Elena. "Since when do you hire staff who look like they've just rolled out of someone's guest room?" The glass door to Julian's office slid open. He didn't look up from his papers, but his voice cut through the room like a blade. "She's not an intern, Marcus. She's my new executive assistant. And her attire is my concern, not yours." The woman, Isabella Marcus, daughter of Julian's biggest rival, let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Executive assistant? Julian, be serious. She's clutching her coffee like a lifeline and wearing a coat that is 2 sizes too big. If you wanted a distraction from the board meeting, you could have just called me." Elena felt the blood rush to her cheeks. The humiliation of the morning was already heavy, but being talked about like she wasn't even in the room was the breaking point. She stood up, her legs a little shaky but her chin held high. "I'm right here," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And if you're looking for Mr. Vance, he's currently in the middle of a merger archive review. Unless you have an appointment, I suggest you leave your card at the front desk." Isabella froze. Her eyes snapped to Elena, flashing with a dangerous intensity. "Excuse me." "You heard her," Julian interrupted. He finally looked up, but he wasn't looking at Isabella. He was looking at Elena, a strange, dark glimmer of approval deep in his eyes. "Miss Elena is quite right. I'm busy. And she has a lot of work to do." Isabella's face contorted for a split second before she masked it with a forced, sugary smile. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you, Julian. Playing with ordinary girls usually ends in a mess you can't write a check for." She turned on her heel and marched out, the sharp clack of her heels sounding like a countdown to trouble. The silence that followed was thick. Elena sank back into her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked through the glass and saw Julian watching her. He stood up, walked slowly to the glass partition, and pressed a button that turned the transparent wall into frosted glass, cutting off the rest of the office's view. He opened the door to her small cubicle and stepped inside. The space suddenly felt tiny. "That was bold," he whispered, leaning against the doorframe. "Isabella Marcus doesn't forget a slight. You just made an enemy of one of the most powerful women in the city." "She was being a bully," Elena muttered, focusing on the files. "And I don't like being called a mess." Julian reached out, his hand hovering near her chin before he caught himself. He pulled back, his expression hardening into that familiar wall of ice. "Just make sure that boldness translates into your work. I need those summaries by 1 p.m. If you're going to act like an executive assistant, you'd better start producing results like one." As he turned to leave, he stopped at the door. "And Elena, there's a box on the chair in the lounge. It's from a boutique downstairs. Change into what's inside. I won't have my staff looking like they belong to someone else." Elena opened the box once he was gone. Inside was a tailored midnight blue power suit and a pair of designer heels. There was no note, just the faint scent of sandalwood clinging to the fabric. She realized then that Julian wasn't just protecting her, he was grooming her for a game she didn't even know how to play yet. The chandeliers of the gilded oak dripped with crystals, casting a sharp, unforgiving light over the mahogany table. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a battlefield. Julian sat at the head, his expression a mask of bored indifference, while across from him sat the heads of the Sterling group, men who looked like they chewed glass for breakfast. Elena felt the weight of the midnight blue suit Julian had bought her. It fit like a second skin, armored and elegant. She sat to his right, her laptop open, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "The merger terms are unacceptable, Vance," the elder Sterling barked, slamming a hand on the table. "You're asking for 70% control. We built this company from the ground up." Julian didn't blink. He swirled his wine, the dark red liquid catching the light. "And you're currently running it into the ground. My capital is the only thing keeping your creditors from the door. 70% is a mercy." "We have other offers," the younger Sterling countered, leaning forward with a smug grin. "A firm in Singapore is looking to expand. Their numbers were much more favorable." Julian's eyes flickered toward Elena. It was a silent command. He wasn't going to argue, he expected her to win the point for him. Elena's fingers flew over the keys. She remembered a tiny footnote in the archives she'd spent all morning memorizing. A discrepancy in the Sterling Group's offshore tax filings that didn't quite align with their Singaporean interest. Actually, Elena said, her voice cutting through the tension. Every eye at the table snapped to her. The younger Sterling's grin faltered. Go on, Ms. Elena, Julian said, his voice a low, encouraging purr. The Singaporean offer from Lin and Associates? Elena asked, tilting her screen toward the group. According to the public ledger of their holding company, they filed for restructuring 3 weeks ago. Their liquidity is tied up in a legal battle in the High Court. They aren't looking to expand, they're looking for a shell company to hide their debt. She paused, looking the younger Sterling dead in the eye. Unless, of course, you want to merge with a sinking ship. But that would make your board of directors very unhappy, wouldn't it? The silence that followed was deafening. The elder Sterling's face turned a deep shade of purple. The younger one looked like he wanted to vanish into the upholstery. Julian set his glass down with a soft clink. It seems my assistant has a better grasp of your business than you do. He stood up, buttoning his blazer in one smooth motion. The 70% offer stands for exactly 10 more minutes. If I don't have a signature by the time I reach the valet, the deal is dead. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving Elena to scramble after him. Once they were in the cool night air, the adrenaline finally crashed. Elena leaned against the stone pillar of the restaurant, exhaling a breath she felt like she'd been holding for hours. I thought I was going to throw up, she whispered. Julian stopped. He wasn't looking at the car. He was looking at her. For the first time, the cold CEO's mask didn't just crack, it shattered. He stepped into her space, his hand reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was warm, a startling contrast to his icy reputation. You were brilliant, he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. I didn't think anyone could catch that footnote. You just saved me $400 million. Does that mean I get a raise? She joked, her voice trembling slightly. Julian didn't laugh. He leaned closer, his eyes dark with an intensity that made her knees weak. It means you've become far more dangerous than I anticipated, Elena. And far more necessary. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The signature had arrived. But Julian didn't look at it. He was looking at her lips, the distance between them narrowing until the roar of the city seemed to fade into nothingness. The air between them was electric, the scent of rain and Julian's sandalwood cologne mixing into something intoxicating. His hand lingered on her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted every cold word he'd ever spoken to her. Let's get out of here, he whispered. The victory is yours. We should celebrate properly. The drive back to the penthouse was different this time. The silence wasn't suffocating, it was heavy with anticipation. When the elevator doors opened directly into his living room, the city skyline stretched out before them like a sea of diamonds. Julian walked straight to the crystal decanter, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. To the woman who saved the merger, he said, handing her a glass. His fingers brushed hers, and this time neither of them pulled away. Elena took a sip, the warmth of the drink spreading through her chest. I just did my job, Mr. Vance. Julian, he corrected softly. He stepped closer, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of his face. In this room I'm just Julian. He reached out, his hand settling on her waist, drawing her into his space. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as he leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Just as his lips were about to touch hers, to finally bridge the gap that had been aching between them all night, a sharp, insistent vibration shattered the moment. Julian froze. He pulled back slightly, his jaw tightening as he reached into his pocket. He looked at the screen, and the warmth in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a haunting, hollow shadows. I have to take this, he said, his voice dropping back into that icy, professional tone. He walked toward the balcony, sliding the glass door shut behind him. Elena stood in the center of the vast, silent room, watching him through the glass. His silhouette was tense, his hand gripping the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. Even though she couldn't hear the words, she could see the change in him. He looked less like a powerful CEO and more like a man who had just seen a ghost. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the balcony, his voice low and urgent. He glanced back at her through the glass, a look of pure, raw conflict. It was as if he wanted to run back to her and push her away all at the same time. Then she heard one word as the wind caught the door. Father. Julian clicked the phone shut and stared out at the dark horizon for a long minute. When he finally stepped back inside, he didn't look at her. He went straight to the bar and downed the rest of his drink in one jagged swallow. The celebration is over, he said, his back turned to her. My driver is downstairs to take you home, Elena. I'll see you at 7 a.m. Don't be late. The wall was back up, higher and thicker than ever before. The next morning the office felt like a frozen tomb. Julian didn't even look up from his monitor when Elena walked into the glass suite. The celebratory warmth from the night before had been replaced by a clinical, biting silence. Elena sat at her desk, the glowing screen reflecting in her eyes. She couldn't stop thinking about that one word, father. In all the files she'd summarized, Julian's father, Silas Vance, was listed as retired. But the fear in Julian's eyes hadn't looked like a son dealing with a retired parent. When Julian left for a private meeting on the top floor, Elena knew this was her only chance. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked at his closed office door. She shouldn't. It was professional suicide. But the mystery was a physical weight in her chest. She stood up, her heels silent on the plush carpet, and slipped into his office. The room smelled of sandalwood and cold air. His desk was spotless, but tucked behind a heavy bronze paperweight was a locked drawer. Elena reached into her bag. She didn't have a key, but she remembered something from the night of the gala. Julian had a habit of leaving his backup biometric keycard in his spare blazer. She found it. The drawer slid open with a soft, mechanical click. Inside wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a single weathered manila folder labeled Project Phoenix 2011. Elena flipped it open. Her breath hitched. It wasn't business data. It was a series of redacted police reports and a grainy photo of a younger, smiling Julian standing next to a man who looked exactly like him, but with a predatory, dark edge. As she scanned the pages, a name kept popping up, the Blackwood debt. Looking for something, Elena? The voice was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Elena froze. She didn't even have time to close the folder before Julian was standing in the doorway. He wasn't angry. He looked worse, he looked devastated. I saw the name on your phone, she stammered, her face flushing crimson. I thought if I understood I could help. Julian walked toward her, his footsteps heavy. He closed the folder with one hand, his fingers trembling slightly. There are things in this building that don't belong in summaries, Elena. My father isn't retired. He's the reason I became the man you see today. He didn't build this empire, he stole it. And now he's coming back to take the one thing I have left. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for judgment. Now that you've seen the ghost, do you still think I'm just a cold CEO? Before she could answer, his desk phone buzzed. It was the lobby security. Mr. Vance? There's a man here. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says he's the rightful owner of the chair you're sitting in. The color drained from Julian's face. The past hadn't just called, it had arrived. The air in the office turned frigid, the kind of cold that sticks to your bones. Elena looked at the heavy manila folder, then at the terror etched into the lines of Julian's face. She didn't hide the file. Instead, she stepped around the mahogany desk and stood inches away from him, her shoulder brushing his. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered. The heavy double doors of the executive suite didn't just open. They were thrown wide. A man walked in who looked like a ghost of Julian's future. Silas Vance was older, his hair a shock of silver, but he carried a cane topped with a silver wolf's head like a scepter. Behind him stood two men in suits that looked more like bodyguards than lawyers. Julian, Silas boomed, his voice a gravelly resonance that filled every corner of the room. You've done a fine job playing house. The stock price is up. The office is sterile. But a king eventually returns for his crown. Julian's hand gripped the edge of the desk so hard the wood creaked. You were exiled by the board, Silas. You have no standing here. Your Project Phoenix was a crime, not a business strategy. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He turned his predatory gaze toward Elena. And who is this? A new little bird? Does she know that the clean company you've built was funded by the blood of the men I broke? Elena felt a surge of protective fury. She stepped forward, her voice ringing out with a clarity that surprised even her. She knows that Julian built this firm into a global leader while you were hiding in the shadows. And she knows that standing is earned through results, not threats. If you have a legal claim, show us the papers. Otherwise, you're trespassing. Silas froze. He leaned on his cane, peering at Elena through narrowed eyes. She has spirit, Julian. A pity. Spirit is the first thing that breaks when the debt comes due. He reached into his breast pocket and tossed a single gold-embossed envelope onto the desk. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was an invitation to a private auction. The sale of the Blackwood debt notes that Julian had been trying to bury for a decade. If you want to keep this chair, Silas whispered, leaning over the desk until he was face to face with his son, you'll need more than a summary girl by your side. You'll need the keys to the vault I locked 10 years ago. And only I have them. With a final chilling smile at Elena, Silas turned and walked out, his cane echoing like a heartbeat in the silent hallway. Julian sank into his chair, his head in his hands. The Blackwood debt wasn't just money. It was the one thing that could dismantle everything they had worked for. Elena placed a steady hand on his shoulder. We find that vault, Julian. We find it before he does. Julian looked up at her, and for the first time the cold CEO looked truly vulnerable. The vault isn't in a bank, Elena. It's in the old Vance estate. The place I swore I'd never return to. The night was thick with fog as they pulled up to the rusted iron gates of the Vance estate. The manor loomed like a stone giant, its windows dark and hollow. Julian stayed silent, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. We don't have to do this alone, Elena whispered, reaching over to cover his hand with hers. I've been alone in this fight for 10 years, Elena, Julian said, his voice cracking. My father built this place on secrets. I'm afraid of what we'll find. You aren't that boy anymore, she countered firmly. And you aren't alone. They entered the foyer, their flashlights cutting through a decade of dust. Following a map hidden within the Project Phoenix folder, they found the library. Behind a false shelf of leather-bound books lay the vault, a heavy steel door with a mechanical dial. The code, Julian murmured, his brow furrowed. He said I'd need the keys he locked away. But the key isn't an object. It's a date. He dialed in the day he had finally stood up to his father and walked out of the house for the first time. With a heavy clunk, the bolts retracted. Inside wasn't gold or jewels but a series of ledgers and a recorded confession from Silas's old partner, detailing how the Blackwood debt had been paid off years ago. Silas had been using the threat of the debt to stay in power, even though it no longer existed. It's over, Elena breathed, looking at the documents. He has nothing on you. He never did. Julian let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He turned to Elena, the moonlight from the high library window illuminating the tears in his eyes. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a man who had finally been set free. I spent so long being cold because I thought if I felt anything I'd break, he whispered. But you're the only person who looked past the ice. He stepped forward, cupping her face in both hands. This time there were no phone calls, no shadows, and no secrets. He leaned down and kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss that tasted of relief and a brand new beginning. 1 year later, the Sapphire Lounge was once again filled with the elite of the city, but the atmosphere was different. Julian stood by the balcony, but he wasn't alone. He held Elena close, his arm draped protectively around her waist. Silas Vance was gone, his reputation dismantled by the evidence they had found that night. Julian had transformed Vance Global into a firm built on transparency and heart, with Elena serving as his partner in every sense of the word. Thinking about spreadsheets? Elena teased, nudging him with her shoulder. She looked radiant in a gown of shimmering gold, a stark contrast to the nervous assistant she had once been. Julian laughed, a real warm sound that turned heads across the room. He leaned in, whispering into her ear. I'm thinking that the best thing I ever did was get bored enough to let a certain girl poke me in the chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring that outshone every diamond in the room. Elena, you saved my company, but more importantly, you saved me. Will you stay by my side forever? With tears of joy, Elena nodded. Always, Julian. No spreadsheets required. As they kissed under the glow of the city lights, the cold Sioux was officially a legend of the past. The future was bright, warm, and filled with a love that no debt could ever touch.